Oh, that's perfect.
That's it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Welcome everyone to the next lecture in our fall 2020 lecture series. My name is Clay Odom, Associate Professor in the School of Architecture and Co-Chair of the Lectures and Exhibitions Committee at the University of Texas, along with David Heyman. Welcome to all of you to this fantastic next lecture by Liz Ogbu. Just a couple of housekeeping things. It's okay if you want to show your face during this. It's nice to see everyone. We have such a great community of people that are joining us today. So it would be nice, especially for Liz, to see if you feel up to that, which you may not. And then afterwards, certainly during the question and answer period, please do show your face, especially if you're asking questions. And join us next week for the next lecture in the series. And please check out the UTSOA social media channels for additional information, links, and live streams. I'd like to introduce Alex Yeshka, Assistant Professor in the School of Architecture, to do our introduction. Take it away, Alex. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, our guest today is Liz Ogbu. Liz, thank you for being here. Liz is a designer, an urbanist, social innovation strategist. She's a spatial justice activist. Liz holds a Master of Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and she's now on faculty at UC Berkeley and Stanford's D School. She's the founding principal of Studio O, which is a multidisciplinary design and consulting practice that uses design to catalyze sustained social impact. The work of Studio O blends different agendas. Human-centered design research methodologies are used together with architecture and creative placekeeping, as they call it, principles, cross-disciplinary design thinking frameworks, and social justice and equity agendas, of course. Liz has over a decade of experience in engaging with communities through design in challenged urban environments across the globe. She designed shelters for immigrant day laborers in the US, as well as helped setting up water and health enterprises for low-income residents in Kenya. Liz was the first scholar in residence at the Center for Art and Public Life at California College of the Arts. She was also the innovator in residence through the inaugural IDEO Fellowship, which was dedicated to fostering global poverty reduction through design and innovation. She was also design director at Public Architecture, which worked with designers to improve communities, specifically through design. Among the honors that recognize her expertise in engaging and transforming unjust urban environments, I'll just mention the 2009 Holcim Global Innovation Prize, as well as the 2019 Titan Awards from the International Interior Design Association. This tells us how broad the scope of Liz's work is. She's also the recipient of the 2020 Argonne Award of Excellence in Sustainability, which was awarded by Southface Institute, a leader in research, design, and implementation of regenerative economy for the Southeast of the United States. Liz, welcome to the UT School of Architecture, and the Zoom stage is all yours. Please take us through the apocalypse. Thank you.
No pressure whatsoever.
No.
So thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be able to share some of my work and also to just have this conversation. And I really want to posit that I'm definitely not offering this as I have the answer to what it means to design in the apocalypse, but more I want to talk about what it means to recognize the place in which we are at, and to also talk about what are strategies that we can start to deploy if we want to be on the right side of justice, as they say. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the philosophy that I have, but also show you some projects and share some tools, and hopefully have enough time at the end that we can also engage in a conversation about some of these things. So the first thing I want to start with is something that I do at all of my talks, and it's a way of level setting to get you into the space that I think about when I'm talking about my work and thinking about the types of things that I'm doing within my project. So I'm going to ask for you to close your eyes if it is safe to do so wherever you are. And I know it's a little bit weird and we're on Zoom, but just indulge me for a couple of minutes. It's a very like woo-woo California thing I'm about to do with you, but trust me, it's completely harmless. And so now that you have your eyes closed, I would love for you to take a deep breath in through your nose and then out through your mouth. One more time, in through your nose and out through your mouth. Keeping your eyes closed, I want you to imagine your favorite place. It can be a place from your childhood, a refuge to you now in these pandemic times, or an imagined place from the future. It might be a place where you're by yourself or with other people. Perhaps it's a place that makes you feel happy or sad or comfortable, relaxed, or safe and loved. Once you have an image of it, I want you to let it invade your senses. Think not only what it looks like, but also what it sounds like, what it feels like, even what it smells like. Hold that image and that experience. Take another deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Again, in through your nose and out through your mouth. And now, open your eyes. So that wasn't so bad, was it? So whether you realize it or not, this place that you've thought of is a place that holds your story, at least a piece of it. And I think we're so used to thinking of our stories taking place in a digital sphere, but the reality is that space always surrounds us, serving as the armature for our stories. And so when I tell people that I'm an architect, they ask me to tell them what kinds of buildings do I do. And I say that like I often design the spaces that help shape people to live their best stories. And over the years that I've come to realize that for those of us with privilege, whether it's through race, class, gender, et cetera, there's an abundance of places that enable us to do that. And my work is often focused on working with communities for whom there are few spaces that celebrate their stories, few spaces that support them to thrive. These are communities who are living with the burden of the lack of spatial justice. So, spatial justice means that justice has a geography and that the equitable distribution of access, services, and opportunities is a basic human right. And to say what that looks like, you know, we don't have spatial justice when in countless cities it's possible to see differences in where industrial uses ended up and gleaming office towers didn't, where insufficient bus routes occurred and multi-million-dollar transit centers didn't, where vacant lots proliferated and nice parks didn't. And we can't talk about injustice in space without also talking about injustice across race and class. Because the truth of the matter is that Black, brown, and poor communities have disproportionately had less access. And sadly, that often has been no accident. And as long as we continue to be separated and selectively harmed by space, we cannot achieve any of the other justices that we want to achieve. And so I think what I want to get at is that the need to hold that, like, while we can believe that justice is a universal right, that as long as we live in a world where it's defined by multiple layers of oppression, that we can't actually find a place where justice is a lived experience for all of us. And so this is the conversation that I'm having in my work right now and that I have been having, and wanting to talk about what does it mean for us to shift that and to think about architecture not as a bystander to all of those conversations, but actually participating in it. And I talk about the long arc of spatial justice because I think it's really important that we understand that we're not starting at a point zero, that unless we're embracing and reckoning with the entirety of what has been created, which is often outside of what we understand as scope, that we can't actually talk about what does it mean to move forward and to heal. And so as we get into all of this, I'm also holding two very particular things right now in this time. So earlier this summer, as I was wrestling with the state of the world, from thinking about like, how do we hold everything that is happening in these complicated times? And knowing that we're wrestling with the murders of innocent Black men and women, that we're dealing with communities that all of a sudden are getting to the point where their work is seen as essential, to looking at how COVID has wreaked havoc, particularly on communities of color and the poor. I've started to think about what it means to think about moving from the state of urgency that we seemed locked in, back to the state of complacency that we also seem locked in. And it seems in the time of urgency, we only know this idea of acting now, trying to really address the things so that we don't have to feel bad anymore. And I would say it's not necessarily urgency, but emergency. And then once we feel like we've done enough, then we move back into the state of complacency, where business as usual is okay, but perhaps with a better Band-Aid. And so we've been at this place before, and it's absolutely critical that we think of not how do we become responsive in this time, just so that we can be able to move back to normal, but looking at how do we actually shift the systems so that we do not return back to a place where, to be honest, all of these realities were already existing. We just weren't quiet enough in our world to be able to see them, or I should say some people weren't. So how do we hold this in thinking about how do we move forward? How do we break past the cycles? And in particular, when I think about the state of the built environment professions, I also think about how we've actually been complicit, right? None of these things that have happened have been by accident. The system is working exactly as it has been designed. And architecture and planning, when it is done in the typical methodology that I was trained in, that I'm sure many of you were trained in, its purpose is just to replicate those systems. And so if we're going to talk about how do we move differently, how do we do differently, how do we break this loop that has presented us with these images that we see here, then we have to be similarly intentional about our focus. And so it's with that I want to set the context of actually looking at the things that I'm about to present. So I'm going to frame these a little bit as tools for action. And I would, as I said, I have no, for me, it's breaking out of the like kind of white supremacy mindset, is accepting that I don't want you to look at me as a leader and copy all of these things down as I must do this and then I will fix everything. That these are more talking about conversational shifts that we need to have in the way that we work, and talking about the different things that you need to go on a journey to learn how to hold. And so really, I'm hoping that this is a platform for talking about what those things might be, and that in this time of the apocalypse, which is really just meaning that things are being uncovered and revealed so that a broader cross-section of people, not just those who've been most harmed, can see it. How do we do it differently? How do we change the way in which we understand what our way of being should be? So look at these projects and things that I'm about to share with that in mind. So one of the things that I think a lot about is how do we shift from being unintentional actors to intentional accomplices? So I would say that oftentimes when I have a conversation with architects and other built environment professionals about how do we engage in these environments, I often hear, well, we don't have any power. This is what's been dictated by the client. I can tweak maybe here and there, but really it's out of my hands. And I basically call bullshit on that. anytime an action of ours can actually impact the life of someone else, we have power. The real question is, are you choosing to use that power? To be a bystander is actually unacceptable in this time. There's no neutrality. And so if you're choosing not to act, you're choosing not to leverage the power you have, whether it's in choosing which clients you take, choosing how you structure a process, choosing what that process holds or who it brings to the table, then essentially you're choosing to be complicit in the harm. So I would almost argue, even though I've listed unintentional actors, I don't actually think there is such a thing as unintentional actors. You're making a choice. It's just a matter of whether or not you are acknowledging that you're making a choice. So I like to think about how do we move more towards intentional accomplices. And I know that people often use the word ally, and I would say I see all of this as a spectrum. I think allyship is good and appropriate in certain situations, but I would also say that allyship is different than being an accomplice. Allyship is saying that I support you, and perhaps doing it in a visible way, but it's not actually risking anything. And so I prefer to use the terminology of accomplice, which sort of says, I will risk my position, I will risk my rights in order to fight for justice, because I understand this isn't just your fight, this is our fight. So when you speak up to a client, when you advocate for something in a way that perhaps risk your position or risk a project, that's being an accomplice. And so that's something I want to speak to, of thinking about how do we do that in a deeper and better way. This quote, I think, really speaks to it. It was actually done within the medical profession, but I actually think it has some appropriateness for this conversation here. It is chilling to see the great institutions of healthcare, hospitals, physician groups, scientific bodies assume that the seat of the bystander is available. That seat is gone. To try to avoid the political fray through silence is impossible, because silence is now political. Either engage or assist the harm. There is no third choice. So for me, that really is about, like, what are the things that we are doing to engage in this conversation and be complicit in the justice and be complicit in the healing. So I'm going to share a project that I actually did very early in my career, but I think it starts to talk about this idea of what does it mean for us to leverage our power in service of something. So this project is called the Day Labor Station, and it was something that I worked on while I was at Public Architecture, which had been mentioned in my bio. And it was a project looking at day labor hiring sites. And I should note that this was definitely before the Trump administration. It was back in the mid 2000s. And so I think that's some important context to also understand that it was sort of outside the lens of the ICE raids and a lot of stuff that we're seeing right now. So this project was really in response to the proliferation of day labor hiring sites across the US. And they're also global, but our work was very particularly focused on the US. And so day labor hiring sites were often street corners, gas stations, Home Depot parking lots. And they were a place where people were looking for a day's work for a day's wages. And back in the mid 2000s, there was roughly about 100,000 men and women who were looking for day labor work every day. Now, the truth of the matter is that day labor work is actually something that goes back for centuries. In this country, we had an earlier history of it with the dock workers. And so it's always a way in which people were, in particular immigrants and recent immigrants, could be able to access into the economy. It's just in this time that it became also highly politicized. The vast majority of hiring sites didn't have any access to toilets or water, and this, or even shelter, as you can see these men standing outside. And so this was something at Public Architecture that we thought we could help out with. And it was acknowledging also that there was never going to be a day laborer who was going to come into our office and ask, hey, I'm having a problem at the corner, because at the time that we started doing this project, these sites also became heavily politicized. And if you can imagine, it was a politicization that seems a little bit quaint right now, where if you were angry about the day labor issue, you could go to your local day labor hiring site, because there was one in almost every city. So if you couldn't go to the border, you could go here. And so we understood that these sites were contentious sites, and understanding that day laborers were the ones who needed to actually be our clients, not the person who's going to pay for it. And how do we intercede in those situations and support the workers in being able to not only earn a wage, but have a place in which they could thrive. So we went and we spent time in day labor hiring sites across the country, sitting in conversation with the workers. And out of it, we came up with this design. It was sort of based on a prototype model. So this one that you're seeing is the deployment of it for a potential site in Los Angeles that was supposed to serve 200 workers. And in it, we were thinking a lot about how hiring sites actually operate. So creating an open space. One of the things that we heard from the workers was that even though there are actually often systems that dictate who gets hired when, the ability of each person to see each and every employment transaction was actually critical. And so that really then set up how we designed the orientation. What you see in the middle was actually an idea of the station having to serve multiple uses. So there often, but not always, is a coordinator on site. It could be one of the men. It could be, there were things like Catholic relief services that was starting to support the work here. And so having a place where someone like that could be. And then we also looked at, well, how is this thing sustainable? And so actually creating an income generating food business, a la taco truck, that could be put into the station. And then what you see on the right was one of the things that we also found in talking with the workers and nonprofits that serve them is that the peak hiring time was often between 6 to 9 a.m. But a lot of the workers tended to hang around after that. Either hoping that someone who's coming late might hire them, or just because this was their community. And so a lot of the nonprofit groups that were supporting the workers had started doing things like offering English classes or other skills training to help support the workers, either to get out of day labor work or just get better jobs within the day labor system. And so we also set up a way that this could convert to a classroom or a meeting space. And so all of these, if we had just gone to the nonprofit that was setting up these worker spaces or engaging with the workers and sort of said, well, the money is going to come from you, or the cities that reached out to us because they wanted to do something with these hiring sites, we would not have necessarily gotten these images that you see here. That a lot of this was really emanating from actually bringing the workers to the table and giving them agency and sort of determining what could happen here. But these would be the typical images that you would share in any architecture presentation. But for me, what is more important with this project was the images on this slide. So, one of the things in conversations with the workers and with nonprofit organizations looking in the immigration rights movement, at the time that all of this was happening, so mid-2000s to like 2008, 2009, it was sort of when the last immigration bill was before Congress and prior to this most recent incarnation. And in that time, one of the things that was seen in the sort of postmortem of why those bills failed was that, while you might have seen thousands of people marching in the street, sort of protesting for immigrant rights, to a politician, what they probably saw was a sea of Black and brown faces. And if they were thinking, sort of strategically, and I put that in scare quotes, about who's going to come to vote for them, it wasn't the people that they saw in the streets. It was the white suburban mom. And that white suburban mom, while compelled that this was an issue, maybe thought, well, you know, I feel for those people, but it's still separate from me. And so one of the things that was happening within the immigration rights movement was how to talk about and how to do things that actually build a more connected community, and that actually create a place where it's not those people, but my daughter's best friend who's under assault by these things. And so as we thought about that in a form of architecture, one of the things that we looked at was like, how does the architecture actually participate in that community building, in setting up the conditions in which those kinds of relationships could be built. And so in that same project for LA that I showed in the previous slide, the site that we had was actually a 2-acre site. And so we actually proposed to build a community garden that would be jointly tended to by the day laborers and the residents who lived in the rather large housing development next to this plot. And using that as a form of creating a place where a whole range of programming could happen, that it was around building those connected communities. And so this project was also one, it was mentioned in my bio about the Wholesome Award. And so what you see on the right is a poster that we created to that. And in it are, the boxes are actually quotes that I received from emails working on it. And it's everything for, thank you for doing it for those workers, to build it and we will burn it down with those nasty Mexicans. That particular one I got after being on the local news in Houston on this, about this project. And so I think for me, these two images speak to thinking about what it means to be an intentional accomplice. It's actually creating the spaces that enable the outcomes, not just the output of the building that we want to see, but also going out there and campaigning for this project, because I got access into spaces that these workers were not getting access into. And so I took that to mean, how do I bring their words? How do I bring their stories? The image that you see is from a portrait series that we did as part of this project, where we shared some of the stories of the workers. And to get hate mail was actually a great thing, because it meant that like I was risking something. And I think that that's really important to ask in any project. What are you risking to make this happen, to give folks who've traditionally been ignored or had their rights stripped an opportunity to be able to thrive? The next shift that I think about is, what's the difference between dreaming big and dreaming cold? So as someone who is trained as an architect, you know, it is woven into the DNA of everything that I learned, that like we need to dream big, we need to think of the impossible, create these amazing spaces. Like that's the role that we can fulfill out there in the world. But to dream big, I think often gets us to a place where it's about us, the architect, and not so much about the people who are impacted by what we do. We may say it is, but I think we can only really take into account how we're actually dreaming for and with them if we're actually setting up processes that allow us to take in the entirety of people's stories, both what is existing now, but also what has existed in the past and what they hope for in the future. And so in many ways, that often means that like the brief for what needs to be created doesn't actually come from us or even the paying client, it comes from the folks in the communities themselves. So this is a project that I've been working on for almost 7 or 8 years at this point, here in the Bay Area. And there's a community called Bayview Hunters Point. It's in the southeastern quadrant of San Francisco. It is a community that has historically been emblematic of spatial injustice. So it's kind of been a place where new immigrants and migrants to San Francisco often landed originally. Since the sort of started the 20th century, this ended up being a mostly working class African-American population. This community is also a symbol of environmental injustice. So many of the city's industrial uses found their way into this neighborhood. And that's everything from a power plant, as you see here, to one of the largest sewage treatment plants near a residential neighborhood in this country. And so really the community has also been fraught with, all of that, and adding to, it's also been a site of economic injustice as the naval shipyard closed in the 70s and actually led to some pretty massive disinvestment, which has then made it kind of ground zero for gentrification right now, because as you might have heard, San Francisco, we have a little bit of a real estate crisis. And so if you're looking for something that is quote unquote affordable, you can actually find it in this neighborhood. And so we're also seeing a pretty significant displacement. And so it's in the context of all of that that I started working on this power plant site about 7 years ago, along with 2 local firms, Envelope A plus D and RHAA. And our brief was to really look at this site, which actually now looks like this. So back in the late 90s, residents from the neighborhood, led by the mothers who lived in the public housing on the hill above the power plant, fought for its closure. They were successful. The utility company closed it, tore it down about 10 years ago, and then capped it with asphalt so that the clean soil would not blow away. Now, the intent was that it was probably going to be 5 to 10 years before some development could actually happen here, because there were various things like land entitlements and lease agreements that needed to be negotiated to make the land ready for development. In reality, we're already at past the decade mark, and we're looking at likely 2 decades before there is some development here. And why this is critical is that this asphalt that you're seeing is just representative of the 30 acres of asphalt that make up this site. And so the utility company rightly realized that they could not leave the site vacant for all that time. And so they put out a call to design teams to propose interim uses for the site. And my team responded with this idea that the goal of interim activation for this shouldn't be about, well, let's just put up some shipping containers and bring in pop-up retail in a way that often has been replicated in cities throughout this country as a form of creative placemaking, but actually to start to turn the site over to the community now and use it as a way to understand not only what they want to see in the long term, but how do we give them benefit in the short term that sort of rewards the investment that they've made from being in the community for all of this time. And so we started doing a series of programming, partnering with local organizations and doing everything from job training workshops to yoga days to even an annual circus. In the 7+ years that we have been operational, we've had over 25,000 people come to this site. And all the programming that we did was really generated from conversations with people. So I'm notorious amongst my clients that I often don't do community meetings to start. I often go into conversations with folks in the community, in their homes, in their places of business, wherever they feel comfortable. And I ask them not what they dream for the site, but to tell me the stories of a place, the stories of the neighborhood and the stories of their lives. And out of that, use that information and that data. I like to always refer to Brene Brown's comment about stories being data with a soul. So for me, those stories are an important piece of the architectural work. And then out of that, we actually got the themes that we used to frame the different events that we did. And in framing that and in maintaining the stories, the idea was that this would be an active form of engagement. And the dreams of, if you just handed a 30-acre site to an architect, I'm sure they could come up with lots of amazing things that they could do. But it was really critical to us that the stories that we found on this site become the seeds of us understanding what it is that we need to do. And we tried to set up different ways in which we can hear those stories from people. So from teen workshops to what you see in the middle is a listening booth that we did in partnership with StoryCorps, to even working with young kids And all of that information was then used to actually get us to the different types of programming that you saw. And the idea with that programming was around how do we make visible the dreams that people had in real time, and use that information to then chart out, well, when we get to the point where permanent things can be built, what do they need to look like? So the first permanent piece of the project has moved forward, and it's just along the edge. That still needed to be remediated after we started talking and working on this project. And so what we did was think about that remediation, not just as like, well, let's clean the soil on that edge, but actually how do we restore it to a better level and create a shoreline park? And so a lot of the things that you see in the design of this park came from hearing the stories of people and giving them an opportunity to give input. Those, events like the circus were actually a form of our community meetings. And in doing so by like actually acknowledging that there are a lot of people in this neighborhood who are actually time poor. So rather than asking them to come to a community hall at the end of a very long day to see a project that they might not happen for years, come to a circus, and while you're there, we would engage you in conversations. And then I think the really important thing is like to find ways that you can show that you were listening. And so in the design of this park, from just the idea of elevating things like beauty, which was something that we heard from people, to in the middle and on the right, what you see are narratives of the site. So one of the things that we heard from people was the sense that stories were being lost, and they wanted a place where you would always know what was the story of this place. And so the interpretive signage throughout sort of tells this historical narrative of how we even got to this place. And this middle one, you're seeing the story of the power plant, which wasn't just about, oh, the power plant opened at this point and closed at this point, but also about the struggle and the fight for this land. And what you see on the right is throughout the site, the benches actually have quotes from the StoryCorps recordings with an idea that the words of the residents and all those who are engaged in the fight for this land and in the dreaming of this land could be articulated. And so you get here something that's both a beautiful thing to see, but it's also something that like has a state of wholeness because it actually includes the stories, and that's part of the making of this place. And then it's also sort of understanding that dreaming coal is not treating that the architecture stops when something is made, that you continue to evolve and continue to try and figure out what are the stories that need to be told. And so the two images on the left and in the middle are sort of us continuing to tell these stories. So one of the things that has become very clear is from the time that we started to now, Bayview has experienced even more gentrification. And so as we continue to collect an understanding of people of what they want to see on this site, we had to figure out how to dive deeper into that conversation. And so last year we partnered up with the Question Bridge Black Males Project, which is this amazing video installation that's part of the permanent collection of several museums across the country. And it was an interview project done by several artists, initiated by Chris Johnson. Hank Willis Thomas was also part of it, where they interviewed hundreds of Black men around the country about various questions and then set up the video installation so that it was like a conversation between the men. And so we took that idea of Question Bridge and expanded it to be Question Bridge Bayview to ask questions about race and space. And so throughout the season last year, we had questions or prompts, I should say, of like what you see on the left of, I feel like I belong somewhere when. And this woman was like, I just want people to know that I belong here. And so that led to a whole conversation of what does it mean to feel like you're starting to be a stranger in your neighborhood. And the idea wasn't at getting at some state of resolution, but more sort of saying that sometimes we tend to run away from engaging these topics, when in actuality, what we need is to hold the space and to actually work through the issues. And so this all then led into a day-long symposium where we brought together artists and residents to really hold this conversation of what does it mean to witness the Bayview changing, and how do we honor the past and think about the reckoning that needs to happen in the present. And then what you see on the right is actually an image from this year. So our programming actually could not happen as planned because of COVID, but we also understood that this idea, it's not just about creating cool programming that looks great on presentations such as this, but dreaming whole was sort of like, how do we continue to maintain a relationship with the community and continue to use this space to serve their needs and their wants. And so one of the things that we found once we sort of put a halt on the programming and had conversations with folks in the neighborhood around, well, how could we leverage our resources to support you this year, not knowing what else is going to be possible. And we heard stories of a pretty intense food insecurity issue. So we leveraged our funding and resources and actually became a rapid response site. So we partnered with the San Francisco Produce Market and have been giving away roughly about 300 bags of food weekly. We also hustle our resources. So when we get masks or drawing kits for kids, we include it as part of that. And so we're going to be continuing that through the end of the year. And given that these conditions look like they're continuing for quite some time, we're also looking at how do we leverage our resources to continue to provide this and really this is about understanding that in that ability to dream whole, you can't look at architecture as a transactional act. It's really about a relationship, not just with a site, but with the people who call that site home. And so things like Question Bridge or the work that we've been doing during COVID are really about you leveraging the architecture in support of that relationship building. And then the final shift that I'll just talk about is this idea of a difference between doing good and doing right. So I often say that, and I think some of this may go back to the actor accomplice thing, but doing good is often not about what the other person feels, but about how we feel. It makes us feel good to doing good. And that often becomes a litmus test of whether or not it worked or it was successful. And for me, doing right starts to speak to accountability, right? You can't say you do right unless someone has actually validated that. And so there is a question about who you're accountable to. And in my case, I try to make sure that it's these communities that I've been talking about all throughout this presentation, but actually setting up the ability for them to hold us and the process accountable. And so one project where this has been manifesting quite deeply is a project that I've been working on for the last 4 years in Charlottesville, Virginia. So you may be familiar with Charlottesville based on the sort of racist rallies that happened in 2017 and the killing of Heather Heyer. But the reality is that the wounds of racial injustice predated all of that. Places like Friendship Court, which is a 150 Section 8 property that actually exists just south of the downtown, 2 blocks away from where Heather Heyer gets killed. I walked down that street all the time to get to this place. Places like Friendship Court were created back in the 1960s, where urban renewal came to a town as small as Charlottesville and just so happened to raise the only, or not the only, but the most prominent African-American neighborhood. And then at the same time, also created these concentrated zones of racial poverty like Friendship Court. So in the 40 years that Friendship Court has been in existence, it's never gotten a significant remodel or renovation. And so, the time has actually come to actually look at that. And because of what funding is now, but also recognizing the isolation of this place, we started to look at mixed income models for redeveloping Friendship Court. Now, as I said, it's really important to take into account that there is a past here, whether it is the recent past or the longer past. What you see in the upper right is Vinegar Hill which was the African-American neighborhood that I referenced. And that those are actually the starting points for the conversation. And so one of the things that we realized is that, yes, we can come in with all the intent to sort of build housing, but if we don't create a place where those who've been most harmed by the past actually get a voice in determining what happens in the future, then really all we are doing is that doing good. We have to set up those systems of accountability. So, you know, we looked at the conditions that were happening here. We interviewed people, but the true accountability actually came from being in the conversation with folks and understanding that what needed to happen here was more than just replacing that terrible housing stock. It needed to be how to acknowledge the harm and the wounds that people experience and think about as part of the conditions for moving forward. So we ended up creating an advisory committee made up of residents as well as appointed community members who were appointed based on their ability to add some sort of skill set to the conversation. That committee has been impaneled over the last 4 years, and they have been with us every step of the way. They essentially have become co-decision makers. So no major decision in the design of the property happens without them. And that has led to everything from looking at the model of mixed income and actually creating a ladder of opportunities. So we're no longer just having Section 8 and market rate, but we're actually having other layers of affordability so that like folks can actually move up in place, but we're also not creating an isolation of us versus them. It plugs into the specific design of the spaces, the different types of uses that are here. And then now we're also looking, and that sort of builds on the uses of this idea of not just that we're supposed to be building housing, but we're also supposed to be building opportunity, which is something that we've been pushed to by the residents. So we're looking at things like home ownership schemes, wealth creation programs, et cetera, because one of the things we also realize is that if all we do is build housing, to use the words of one of my clients in that project, then all we're doing is helping the poor to be poor better. So what we heard from the residents is they want this redevelopment. If they're going to endure this project, which will go on for years, they want it to be something that actually gets them to have a better opportunity in life. And so all of that is factoring into how we are scoping the project and what kinds of things we're considering to be part of our remit. So, you know, I've kind of talked about a variety of things and the shifts that need to be made, but really what I'm talking about is design participating in this conversation about working for collective justice. So spatial justice probably makes sense to you as a thing that, like, yes, of course, that's something that we should look at in the nature of design. And like, yeah, we need to think about justice as it relates to space. But as I said before, it's not in isolation. We can't look at it as just one of these things. We have to be able to talk about how are we holding all of these things. And so while that may not necessarily be always embedded in your curriculum, I think it is something that we talk about in terms of, well, how are you taking the time and making space to actually learn about all of these other issues? And how are you looking to figure out how do those threads weave into what we are seeing when we go into communities? And I say this not just for those who are like, yes, I want to work in these communities who have been historically underinvested. I want to work with them. That it doesn't matter if you're wanting to do that or if you're wanting to work on fancy gleaming office towers. The reality is that even in those fancy gleaming office towers, there are people who either support the building of that, who are impacted by its building, who even clean that building, who are often unseen or underseen through our processes. And so until you hold and start to hold all of these things, you can't actually talk about how do you do right work? How do you actually participate in not being complicit in the harm, but participate in being complicit in the healing? So what I've tried to offer are just some frames that you might want to think about, whether you're working on a studio project or whether you're operating in practice. And really to sort of also say that this is not going to be easy. It's not something that we're going to fix in a year or 5 years or perhaps even in my own lifetime. But like, it is important that we all start to mobilize towards it. So I'm just going to leave you with a poem, which I think speaks to that active mobilization and where we need to be mentally. It's called Invitation to Brave Space. Together, we will create a brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that need to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. So with that, I'll say thank you, and it looks like we still have a few minutes for questions, so I'm more than happy to engage in that.
Thank you, Liz. I think we have more than a few minutes. If you have time, we can take a little bit longer than till 2 o'clock. So I'd like to open now exactly to questions from our students and faculty, especially our students. And as you think about the questions, you can just either raise your hand using the digital hand, or if you're too shy, you can type your question and I can read it out. So let's wait to see who has questions, and as you're formulating your questions, I'll ask one that comes to my mind. So first of all, thank you so much for such an inspiring and thoughtful talk, and for setting the ground in such a beautiful way, for taking time to really deeply engage, or take us deeply into projects rather than show us many different projects. I really appreciated that. And, you know, when I look at your work, I think about architecture as a niche, as a social niche, right? And I think that what's so powerful in your work is that you really successfully managed to question the definition of our niche. I would say expanded, but it's not a spatial thing. It's really about opening it up to more and more relationships. And I wonder, you know, those tools for action that you mentioned, where did they come from? You did mention, you know, we know you studied at Harvard, and you mentioned the fact that often we're not equipped with the right tools when we study. I wonder whether you think that the school actually prepared you for this work and you got some of these tools from that, or where else did it come from? If you can just talk about how this process of expanding your niche and finding new tools that were not necessarily the canonical architectural tools, how did that emerge?
Yeah, so everywhere. You know, I think that, as I mentioned it was a different conversation, but like that I went to Wellesley for undergrad, and there actually was no architecture department there. There was a major, and it was sort of like I'm sure that only the faculty will totally know this reference, a choose your own adventure book. So everybody could kind of take their own path to architecture. You could do studios at MIT, which I did, but you could also petition for different courses. And so for me, when I went into architecture studio, I was like, oh, this is all great. Like, I'm super inspired by like being able to create these amazing things and think about how I can shape space, but like, where are the people? I grew up in a family of social scientists. I just happened to be the weird kid in my family who drew. So like, I grew up talking about people, and I did not understand why we weren't talking about that in architecture courses. So like, I took classes in urban economics and urban sociology to try and get that understanding, and then try to figure out, okay, how do I stitch what I'm learning there with what I'm learning here? But then as I went out into the world, I sort of played with other people. I went to conferences that were in other disciplines. I took workshops around issues of trauma. I listened to the folks who were talking about racial justice or disability justice or transformative justice. Like, what are you guys talking about? And I just tried to be a student and listen to all of that. And so I would say I'm still a student right now. Like, I'm still learning things. I spent the last 2 days like in different workshops learning about different things. And I would say the one thing about this time right now is like, there is so much of that stuff out there accessible to be able to engage with. It's a matter of whether or not you're taking the time to do it. And because the blueprint around like how that links to architecture or any sort of built environment thing isn't necessarily, it's not necessarily refined right now. I would say like, it's kind of incumbent on you to sort of start to weave the threads. But I definitely think there are groups like Center for Urban Pedagogy that does workshops. I just attended one yesterday that was done by Creative Reaction Lab out of St. Louis, and they have tons more. I know UT is a participant in the Design Futures program where we've been looking at these issues. But in general, I would say take advantage of any of these talks that are happening now and just ask, what does that make me think about myself and my role in the world? And then when I look at my project, what does that make me think about what I'm seeing right here?
Yeah. Well, there is a question that comes from our YouTube audience, which I will read in a moment, but just to kind of add to that, it was striking that you say dreaming, rather than dreaming big, dreaming whole, and you emphasize the fact that your work is multidisciplinary. And I think in what you say about opening channels, there's a real sign of what really being multidisciplinary means. It's not finding the right collaborators, right? But really opening yourself up to all different professions that can contribute something to a project.
Both and.
Yeah.
Right, like I think when we talk about teams in architecture, we talk about the engineers, right? The structural engineer who's going to be there to make sure that the building stands, the landscape designer who's going to be there to design all these pieces. And I think actually the world of collaborators is far broader than that, right? Yeah. It's broader both in terms of discipline. So if I'm dealing with a project around, and I'm understanding we need to look at issues of wealth creation and economic justice, who's on the team that's supporting our knowledge around that.
Exactly.
And then it's also understanding that oftentimes we don't think of community members as part of the team. Like they're over there in that box, right? So my first step is sort of say, well, actually, no, they're a client too. But the other thing is that they're actually creators of the project as well. Like if it has not been created by their hand, and that's not to say that we don't have anything to add to the table. It's more to say that it's about mutual expertise. And so their expertise is just as valid to this process as our expertise. Yeah. And so how are we setting the table to enable space for that to be shared?
Thank you. Let me read the question from the YouTube audience. So in a field where funding is determined by return on investment, how do you manage to build projects for communities that are often not able to pay? Was it difficult to start your practice?
Yeah, lots of times people ask, well, how am I able to afford to eat? Only do this community-based work. And I would say just straight off, like I have more work than I can handle. I am turning down clients on a regular basis. So I think sometimes I hear this fear from architects that this is a niche thing. And it's like so unsustainable. You can only do it within the nonprofit zone. And I want to just say, no. Like actually lots of different clients, and my clients range from for-profit developers to museums to cities. So like lots of people are trying to figure out how to do this. When it comes to figuring out where the dollars go, I think this ties into one of the comments that I made around the power that we have. So one of the things that happens when I'm working with a client is they kind of trust me to sort of say what the process needs to be. Now, oftentimes when we think about what the process needs to be, we think about our zones of like conceptual design, schematic design, design development, and that's the process that we hold. But the definition of what needs to exist within that is kind of up on us. We just replicate what has always been done. But if we were to try to like tease that and blow it out, there's actually a lot of room for action. It requires more time, right? Like if I laid out most of the projects that I'm on, even if they started off as short-term things, they have generally lasted for years. But that's because we've just expanded the process to contain what it needs to contain. So that's the first place where I think the dollars can go, right? Is like, yeah, maybe you've been scoped for conceptual design, but what needs to happen as part of that? And then the other thing is, there's this really great woman named Jess Gars who used to work with Surdna Foundation, and she has this comment that I really love, that like our budgets are a reflection of our values. So when you develop a budget for a project, what value is it communicating? Like who's getting that money? And I think again, this is another situation where like we often, connect the dots to where it has always gone, instead of saying, well, if we were really to hold true to this value, where would that money go to? And there is always ways to stretch those dollars to actually make a values-based argument as opposed to just a profit-based argument. Mm-hmm. I just think we often don't risk it to stand up for that to happen.
Thank you. So I see a question from a student, but I also know that our Dean Addington wanted to ask a question. Michelle, why don't you go ahead, and then
Although I really liked Timmy's question here. Why don't we start with Timmy's question?
Okay.
And I'll follow up with mine.
Perfect. Tammy, do you want to read your question? That would be great.
Sure.
Thank you.
I just asked, I was saying that I feel that in my experience in my studios that I've taken so far, the human experience is discussed and emphasized in those courses, but it's often abstracted. So in that we assume so much about the way people experience the designs that we're proposing in these classes. It often feels that we're perpetuating the thinking that we as designers understand people more than they understand themselves and how they're going to experience that space. So I wanted to ask, how would you propose that studios and design courses go about exposing students to the real experiences and perceptions of people in architecture and design spaces?
Thank you.
Thanks, Tammy, for asking a really simple question.
Redesign our curriculum, right?
I mean, so it's a complicated and challenging question, right? Because in some ways, studio has been set up as this opportunity for students to be able to explore and develop their design vocabulary and experience. And at the same time, because it is divorced, it often feels from the ground, it often feels like creating these faux conditions that aren't actually real. And at the same time, I don't want to have all of these studios helicoptering into communities and sort of saying, we need a live patient. Can you please come and serve in this way? So I think, studios that do have an on the ground component aside, like I have a whole set of things around that like, how do we do that more ethical? But I'm going to like take it for the studios that are not doing that for a second and just sort of say that I think that an important thing is, well, how are you building in the conversation of what it is that we don't know? And that, and what are the assumptions, being like just explicit about the assumptions, right? Like what assumptions are we making and how is that actually impacting what we're developing? So that it is at least known that you're not doing, you're not sort of saying, yes, of course, this is the way it is, and this is the way that community would think, but sort of saying, we don't have that information, so we're making this assumption and holding yourselves accountable for challenging around that. And then the other thing that I would say is maybe looking at the process as a sort of reflexive thing of like, okay, what does this design or what does this action tell us about how we have, tell us about the like structures of oppression that underlay our decision making. So for instance, if you were to sort of say, oh, I think this community would need, I look at all these needs of statistics that I'm seeing in this community, they don't have, they have food deserts, they don't have enough parks, et cetera. So that's going to dictate my program of what I do here. So is there ever a conversation of questioning, well, how did that situation get into being in this place? Like what role did we play in actually creating that? And if we are going to talk about addressing things like food justice, what are the questions that we would need to ask the community to understand whether or not that is even a valid concern? Like, what would this project be if they came back to us and sort of said no? And so it's almost to sort of say that, I remember being in studio and I would say at the end of every semester, final review, reviewers are always saying, well, it'd be great if you did this or do this and do this. And of course, studio's over. There's no additional thing, but it's very clear there's so much more that could be developed after that point. And so I think it's really holding that, like, you're not trying to get to a solution. You're trying to like advance the conversation of what does it mean to hold this space. And so I think the questions that I'm prompting that should be asked, it's to sort of say that you're acknowledging there's no way we could solve it right now because we don't have enough inputs, and we're understanding that these things are still open questions, but this is where we're taking it to based on our assumptions, but we also appreciate that our assumptions could be wrong.
Great. Michelle, do you want to go ahead, or there is a question from Jennifer as well?
I'll go ahead, and this actually relates to what you were talking about early on in your presentation about urgency versus complacency, and how we react to, let's say, different types of stressors that are coming in, or different types of let's just say cracks in our world that have opened up, and how we respond to those. If I think back to where we first started dealing with issues of sustainability in the environment in the field of architecture, it was actually incredibly early in comparison to what was happening in the rest of the world. It's the 1960s. We are now 60 years later, and it is still not something that is fully enfolded into our practice or is embedded as a foundational aspect of what we do. It has, fortunately, it took about almost 40 years for it simply to become no longer marginalized or no longer dismissed. And so more acceptance to it. But we're at this point now that's 60 years in, way too late for us to actually sort of radically make the changes that we need to make in this. And so when I think about not being so urgent in order to, do, let's just say, the quick manifestos, the quick actions that make people feel good, and going back to complacency, I'm also equally as concerned about the fact that without action and without relatively quick action that takes advantage of that crack, that opening, that we might just shift back into complacency regardless. That as winter comes, as protests begin to die down, people will start looking in another direction again. How do you begin to sort of balance what is truly urgent in terms of, not truly urgent, but what are the kinds of actions that actually can continue to sort of widen that crack, open that crack up deeper, and lead to more meaningful results in the long term, versus those actions that are simply meant to sort of paper over the divide?
Yeah, that's a great question. Also another easy one. So
it's a discussion for a longer period of time that we should think about having, but
yeah, no, I mean, so I've been joking, not joking, that like what happens after everybody finishes reading the books, right? In this time where, the top 10 bestsellers on the New York Times bestseller list were all the books about racial justice, right? At some point, people are going to get tired of being uncomfortable. And that's kind of when the slip back into a state of complacency starts to happen. And so I think maybe a way to hold the urgency is that it's urgency as in emergency. And so it's like all about like acting fast. And I would say that complacency is also about acting fast, because in the complacent time, we don't have time to deal with that community harm, right? We've got to get this thing built. Or, people may lose their jobs working in the coal field. So we don't have time to talk about environmental justice. And so it's always this, the speed basically negates any ability to actually sit with things and to redefine things. And so for me, it's more like, how do we it's like a ping pong right now. And like, how do we just sort of create a third space? And what does that look like? And in that third space, I think it's like redefining the terms and conditions of how we operate, and also being willing to accept that we're going to be uncomfortable for some time, right? Because both urgency and complacency are kind of about comfort, like, and preconditions of what that comfort needs to be, which is often rooted in the systems of oppression. And so in that third space, you know, it's, at least as it comes to sustainability, I often think of the UN's Brundtland report in '87 that talked about meeting the needs of the sustainable development being meeting the needs of the present without sacrificing the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And to me, in that definition, it's about this idea of care and interdependence, which is often not how we talk about sustainability, right? Like we often talk about, at least in the built environment, it often gets reductive to the place of like, what are the materials that we're building? Or what are the like systems, mechanical systems that we're putting in? But if we, and that seems all rooted in this urgency, complacency dialectic. But if we were to sort of say like, well, what does it mean to care for another human being? What does it mean to care for the land? What does it mean to see any action on one impacting the other? Like that's a whole new conversation that operates in a different time scale than the urgency or complacency. So what I've been looking at a lot lately is like, well, what does it mean to build a platform to have that third space conversation? And how do we hold time in that conversation? How do we hold the issues in that conversation?
Thank you, Liz. We have at least 4 other questions. So I will start. You tell me when to stop. Jennifer, if you can read your question, that would be great. Or rephrase. Jennifer. Is Jennifer there?
Hi, yes, can you all hear me?
Fantastic, yeah.
Okay. Given the shifts in economic disparity seen in large cities and across the country, have you seen an increase in client requests for the use of hostile architecture, such as spikes on sidewalks or building elements? And do you think it is productive to push back on the use of these methods?
I'm sorry, Jennifer, can you repeat that last part of like, do I see clients doing what?
Sorry.
Clients requesting for use of hostile architecture. Do you think it's productive to push back on the use of these methods? Sorry,
in a word, yes. I mean, I think, you know, the conversation I often have with clients at the beginning of a project is like, well, what is it that we're actually trying to, so client as in paying client. The conversation I have with them is like, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve here? Right? Like, what is success? And I know that I talked a lot about framing the success from the sort of perspective of the folks impacted, but I think it's a both and situation, because unless I understand what success is for the traditional client, when they start to push for something that completely goes against the values, it becomes impossible for me to be able to effectively argue against that if I don't understand where they're trying to get to. So I do as much work trying to understand them, where they're coming from, how they're holding the various systems of impression, so that like I can understand how do I push them. And I sort of see my role as, and this goes back to the whole accomplice thing, that if there is something that is coming in that like, while I understand the response, like it, in most cases, things actually follow a very logical line. So when somebody is pushing a hostile architecture, it's actually meaning because they are triggered and this is their response to that situation. So my work is to understand, well, what is triggering them? Is it possible to actually address that trigger? And is it possible to frame for them that there are other ways to respond to that trigger than this piece of hostile architecture? And then if like we are at an impasse, like I have fired clients, I've walked away from projects. Like I think, you know, you have to be willing to do that, to sort of say that like you're going to stand by your values.
great. David, do you want to go ahead?
Liz, thank you for your talk. I really, I think it's spectacular subject matter, and there's so many questions that follow from it. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about authorship. So my daughter is a doctor, and she always says that the difference between being a doctor and being an architect is you do all this diagnosis, you do all this analysis, you listen. But if I'm a doctor and I tell the patient not what they want to hear, based on what they've told me, then they accept it. But you as an architect, like you don't, right? It's a different expectation. So you've described this kind of world where you do this immense amount of listening and registering desires. And I wonder how it is, how you describe to the students how, when as an architect, I guess, and this is where authorship, the question of authorship comes in, because it's not just invisible. I mean, at some point in time, it seems to me you must have come across situations where the thing you have to recommend runs contrary to what you have heard as desires, and I wondered how you negotiate that a little bit. And if you could, because it seems, I know, I'll just say this from my experience with a lot of, especially the undergraduates, it's like the idea of service in this way is to listen and to do, in a sense, what you've been asked to do as a voice for those who don't have a voice. But often that voice requires you to say no or not exactly what you want. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that in your practice. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I often talk about like how after the sort of modernist movement where that begat urban renewal and tower block public housing, that was kind of the rise of the community planning movement, which produced a lot of great things. But there was also sometimes a little bit of a like, well, really it's just about doing what the community says, right? Like that the problem of you know, the sort of architects who perpetuated things like urban renewal was the hero thing. We didn't listen. And so now it's just that we only have to listen. And I think there's something somewhere in between all of that, where it's like understanding, well, what is the expertise that we can bring, but then how do we marry it with the community's expertise? And so one of the ways that I address that is to sort of say, like, one, I have been equipped through certain tools and pieces of information through my like education and what the like sort of paying clients give me privy to. And if I'm bringing a community member along, then I have to recognize that while they have a certain expertise, there are certain tools and information that they have not been given privy to. So part of my job is, how do I give them the information and the skills that allows them to be effective decision makers and partner the things that they know with what we're bringing to the table as part of this project. So there is a health, like in the Charlottesville example, like we've done trainings, we've slowed things down when it's become clear that like the committee actually needs more information to be able to be a good decision maker in this place. And then the other thing I would say is like, I'm also transparent with whatever data that has been collected. So if I'm collecting things from surveys or conversations, that always gets shared back to the community to sort of say, this is what we heard. Did we get it right? And then the final piece that I would say within that, well, actually, I'll give two quick anecdotes, both with the Hunters Point project, which I think kind of maybe hit to your point. So in the like sort of reflection of, did we get it right? There was, we were at a point where we were developing the interpretive signage, and there was a committee that had been impaneled throughout the project, and we presented to them regularly. And so we got to the point where we were presenting the final text of what happened, or what was going to be on the signage. And one of the women raised her hand and was like, whoa, 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 hold up. Like, no, like, how are we at this place where we're at the final design of this thing? Like, I don't remember having this conversation, or that you've talked to people, like, blah, 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 blah. Not to minimize what she's saying, I'm just trying to short circuit the story. And so I was able to then say, okay, let me show you the timeline. So, and I brought out all the different events that we had. I brought out everything that was shared to community members at those events, the responses that we got back, and how that led us to this next step. And so once we walked through all of that, she was like, oh, okay, so my issue actually is with the way that this text is phrased. I don't think it actually says what it needs to say. So rather than us relitigating the entire project, because I had the data and the documentation and it was made super transparent, we were able to focus on what the actual problem is. And I think sometimes you end up having these blow up meetings because they're actually arguing about a thing that is not the thing. And so like the need to communicate the conversation and make the conversation transparent and visible at all times so that you can actually have a conversation about the real thing that is the problem. And then in another meeting on that project, actually earlier on, I sort of said to community members, like, well, can you give me some ideas of what are, like, if you could imagine anything being here, what would you like to see? And one community member said, similarly, hold up. You know, I imagine that you have a budget. So why don't you tell us what that budget is before we go off dreaming all these fanciful things? And I said, if I tell you what the budget is, which I will later on, but if I tell you what the budget is now, you're going to tell me the things you think I can afford to do. And if we're actually going to create a place that meets your needs and your wants, like, we need to talk about what your desires are and come up with the values around that. And then with our budget, we can figure out how to achieve your value and these values you've articulated with the money that we have, rather than looking at it as a list of like ticky-tack things that we add on or not, right? And so in that way, we can create a project that is filled with what a community loves instead of filled with what we can afford to produce. And I think those are two very different things. And so it's super transparent that there is a budget, but we also need to do this first so that we can get to this place.
Great. I don't know if we can still take two questions. There's one from Lalitha. Do you want to go ahead? At least one. Let's try to.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to be quick. I'll try to be quick.
As long as we're out by 12:30. I'm supposed to moderate a thing on, sorry, at the half hour, I'm supposed to moderate something about solitary confinement. And like,
okay. Okay. Wow. Okay. Nice segue. Okay. This is it. The projects, I'm dying to know more about your work, so I'm very excited about it. I'm not an architectural, and some of the folks know that I'm not an architectural historian. I'm not part of the School of Architecture, but I do film, and I'm interested in questions of social justice and space. I'm trying to talk fast so that you can go. Let me slow down.
Slow down.
Okay.
We have at least 8 to 10 minutes. So
okay, great. So this is it. So part of your projects that you've presented today, be it the day laborers or the Section 8 in Charlottesville, and I'm very obsessed with HUD and Section 8 housing, etc., or Hunters Point, are about places that you've refurbished, short of a better word. That is, they've been recycled spaces, etc., which I find really interesting. And the method and your deep commitment to collaboration is a community that is already there. I'm interested. I know this is difficult. What about a community that you vision, a community that is going to come into being through architecture? I know this sounds like a heroic architect of the 1960s. I get that. I know the hesitation. But nevertheless, as architects, despite somebody's question about saying we are not taught this in studio, I think architects can imagine things that we cannot. I mean, the right to abstraction is something that you're trained to do. Okay, and somebody like me leans on you. I mean, I do abstraction in my writing or in film, but I'm curious about what would that be, because I'm sort of like, I'm drawing a quadrangle out here, because one of the things that I heard an African-American filmmaker, Michael Moon, was talking about, this is so interesting. He says, yeah, we talk about gentrification, but there's actually a peasantification of people being thrown out of Harlem, people being thrown out of Brooklyn, people being thrown out of the East Side in Austin, and then heading off to South Carolina, which is about 2 generations ago, people fleeing from there, right? And frankly, as an immigrant, who wants to live in the country? Who wants to live in suburbs? I cannot imagine living anywhere but in a city. And Austin is still a suburb for me. So it's sort of like this peculiar space of how does one imagine a community? Because we need architect angels, not necessarily heroic architect, but we need all of you to be the angels on our shoulder to imagine newer, right? Not just dystopian, but what in that moment when you had, it's about budgets and HUD committees, and I get all that, right? But there must be a way that you have a right to imagine as well, right? Not just always to fix and do the diagnostics. Yes.
Maybe I'm sorry to jump in. Since we have very little time, there's a question that is related to that. Maybe then Liz can just wrap up on those 2 questions. It's from Samir. You can read the question. It's about scale, which I think is related to this.
Sure. So
go ahead.
So you've mentioned that you've worked with nonprofits, for-profits, and with cities in the past and through your career. And given the wide range of opportunities to facilitate and pursue justice, do you believe there's a particular scale or context of a project that is most effective in promoting justice within a community?
Thanks, Amir. It's all your list now.
Okay, I'm going to go with the first question first, and then come back around to the second one. So I was just writing something yesterday about the intersection of like a just city and the idea of utopia. And I think that, yes, it's true. Architecture and design in general has this ability to imagine things that we have not been able to see yet. And I think that is a very special quality. But I think that imagination always requires some sort of root, right? Like, even if we say that we're just coming up with this thing and it's there, it still started from something. It still started from your life experience. It still started from things that you see out in the world. And so it's like really starting to articulate what are the sources of imagination and being really explicit about that. And making sure that some of this conversation around justice is plugged into those sources. So for instance, right now, I'm talking to a city in Ohio about a piece of land that, classic story. There was an African-American neighborhood, 60s, got razed, neighborhood got displaced all over the place. Now the freeway is coming down. There's a giant strip of green. It's very contentious because everybody has an idea of what they want to do with it. Like, how do we create something there? Because right now it is technically blank space, right? And so there's no community there as of right now. And so the conversation we're having is actually, how do we set up a extended process of community engagement to come up with the RFP for the site? And that process actually has to go into a conversation of what is the history of the land and what is the history of the people on the land. And then what is the history of the city right now? And how does this land situate within that? And only in sort of designing that conversation can we get to a place where we understand what the physical thing that needs to be designed must be. So that's, there will be inspiration there, but its genesis, its root is still in understanding a people history, if you will, so like you have to cast back in order to move forward. And then I think in terms of the scale of operation, Tim Brown once said to me that like he loves bringing architects into IDEO because we have this ability through our training to think of things at the smallest unit, but also at the system. Like if you're figuring out how a building stands up, you still have to understand how these two pieces go together. And you have to hold the vision and understanding of that as one tight, cohesive thing. And so I would say that the scale question for me is kind of a similar thing, right? Like that maybe I'm doing a park or a housing, but like I have to be able to move up and down through different scales. I have to move at the scale of the person and understand, well, what do they need and what are their histories and how have they situated themselves within this? I need to understand it at the scale of the space or collection of spaces. And I need to understand where the like larger movement is. I sat through a 3-hour workshop on design thinking and white supremacy yesterday because it was like important to understand it at that scale, at the conversation and movement scale, so that I could come and talk about this today, or I could come to my project and think about, okay, well, how does that manifest in this actual building? So I don't know that I would say that there is a ideal scale as much as I would say that it's important to be conscious of where you are situating yourself within the scale, right? Like not everybody has to move back and forth. You could still say, you know what, I'm just about the building, but I think it's important that you still understand that the building is surrounded by these other scales. And so even if you're not necessarily with your work fully engaging it, that you're at least understanding how it impacts what you do and how what you do impacts these other scales.
Thank you, Liz. I know that you have something else to go to and it's 2:30 and we could just continue this conversation forever. But I just wanted to go back to what Michelle said initially, asking about complacency. And I think what's amazing in your work is that you're so entangled and meshed in those relationships that it's not an option for you to become complacent because you're part of them. And to me, part of the secret is that you just cannot drop the ball when you're part of a system because it affects you personally. And I just, I'm full of awe for how entangled you are in these relationships. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And yes, if we could all clap, that would be great. You can go ahead. I hope we can have you back at the school at some point, and all the best with all your work. Thank
Yes.
you. Thanks, Liz.
Great to talk to all of you. Thank you for the awesome questions. It's definitely got my mind going. And yeah, I look forward to engaging with you guys more in the future.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Liz. It
Bye.
was good to see you again.
You're amazing. Thank you, Liz.
Okay. I think I can close it, right?